Good evening. Welcome to the New York Society Library. My name is Sarah Holliday. I'm from the library's events department, and I'm just here briefly to welcome you, say a word about tonight's presenters. As we begin, we acknowledge that the library stands on traditional lands of the Lenape people and other indigenous peoples to whom we pay respect. We're pleased to be able to offer a vibrant season of events with authors like tonight's event. Major events are generally open to the public, to members and non-members of the library. So please take a look at our website or speak to a staff member to learn more about what's coming up. I also want to remind you that we are live streaming and recording tonight's event and taking photographs, so please just keep that in mind. We are delighted to have with us Danielle Arceneaux, S.J. Rozan, and Paul Vidich. Ms. Arceneaux's Glory Be, just out from Pegasus Books, is her debut novel and the first of a series, right? Correct. It has been named a Best Mystery Novel of the Year by the Washington Post, and Publishers Weekly called it a delightful debut and said readers will be eager to spend more time with its heroine Glory in future installments. Ms. Arceneaux is a public relations veteran and a veteran traveler. She's joining us tonight just from Brooklyn. We are glad to welcome S.J. Rozan back to the members' room after her participation in a panel we co-sponsored with the Authors Guild a few months ago. Today is the official publication of her book, The Mayors of New York, which, if I'm correct, is the 15th mystery in the Lydia Chin and Bill Smith series. Publishers Weekly says it's another triumph for this talented author. Ms. Rozan has won multiple awards for her fiction, including the Edgar, Seamus, Anthony, Nero, McCafferty, the Japanese Maltese Falcon, and the Private Eye Writers of America Lifetime Achievement Award. Our third panelist is Paul Vidich, whose latest novel is Beirut Station, Two Lives of a Spy. The review in Mystery and Suspense magazine says, first and foremost, it's a compelling story, one that gripped me from start to finish, but it also awakened in me a dormant interest in the complex politics of the Middle East, which seems like a very worthwhile thing to be doing. Crime Reads adds, Vidich's over already solidifies his place in the genre. Readers unfamiliar with his work will be dazzled by his vision. Mr. Vidich is also the acclaimed author of The Matchmaker, The Mercenary, The Coldest Warrior, An Honorable Man, and The Good Assassin. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Lit Hub, Crime Reads, Fugue, The Nation, Narrative Magazine, and Word Riot. We do have copies of all three of tonight's books for sale by our friends from the Corner Bookstore, and the link to purchase books online is in the live stream chat. And we do want to include some question and answer and conversation with the audience, so do please keep your questions and comments in mind through the presentation. Please join me in welcoming Paul Vidich, S.J. Rozan, and Danielle Arceneaux.
Thank you. Is this on?
Can you tell?
Yeah.
It's on. Okay. I'm S.J. Rozan, as you just learned, and we have no moderator tonight. We are our own moderators, and so I'm going to ask the first question of my fellow panelists and then answer it myself, which is, we just heard the titles of your books. Tell us a little about the book. Danielle, will you start?
Sure.
Tell us about Glory Be.
I'm Danielle Arceneaux, and I just want to say I'm so happy to be back here at the Society Library. I used to live on 81st Street, and I was a member here for many years. And now I live in Brooklyn, so it's a little bit far for me to come on a regular basis, but it's just, I remember really the fireplace going and reading the newspaper. It's just always a lovely experience to be here. My book, Glory Be, is my debut novel, the first in the series, and it's about a woman named Glory Broussard, and she is a Black woman of a certain age. She's heavyset. Her husband has left her. Her daughter has become a lawyer in New York City, and she works as a part-time bookie in a coffee shop in Lafayette, Louisiana, to make ends meet. And when her best friend, who is a nun beloved within the community, dies under mysterious circumstances, she does not believe that it is she's taken her life, as is the official story of record. And she sets off to investigate with her daughter, who in tow, and she's got problems of her own as well. And Glory is she's very, she's religious, and she is judgmental, and she is petty and a little small-minded, and also a blast. So I had a lot of fun writing her.
Thank you.
So my book takes place halfway around the world in Beirut. And it takes place during the 34-day Israeli-Hezbollah war in 2006, which, of course, makes it timely. The book came out 4 days before the current war. And it's a story about, it's a love story, it's a war story, but it's also a story about the cycle of revenge in the region. And so some people, find it timely, and one or two people were sort of not offended, but, were sort of put off by it. Only because the good people are bad and the bad people are good. And the story is about a young woman, a Muslim American woman who has joined the CIA after 9/11 with the idea that she wanted to do good in the world and change the world for the good. And she ends up being part of a small group that works with Mossad that is seeking to undertake an assassination of a Hezbollah terrorist. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And my book, The Mayors of New York, is a private eye novel narrated by Bill Smith, one of my two private eyes. Bill Smith and Lydia Chin alternate as narrators from book to book. This is the Bill Smith book, Lydia Chin is the sidekick. And in the book, the mayor of New York is New York's first woman mayor. And a couple of months after her inauguration, her son runs away from home. And she doesn't want to call in the police because that puts her in a bad political position. So she hires Bill Smith and Lydia Chin to find the kid. But of course, it's not straightforward. And the book takes them all over New York City, which is, I'm revealing a secret here, the real reason I wrote it. Because there are so many great things in New York. The farther you get from 57th Street and Fifth Avenue, the more rich the environment, and that's where I wanted to take them. And so that's the book.
So we're just alternating here as questioners, and my question for the two of you. What drew you to the crime genre in the first place? What is it about genre and crime that excited you to spend so much of your life putting stories together?
All right, let me start with that one because it has been a lot of my life. Crime to me, when you're writing about crime, and especially when you're writing about murder, you're writing about something that matters. Somebody is dead. That matters kind of more than anything, that's you can't get more critical than that. And somebody has to speak for the dead, and somebody has to find not justice, because I'm not a great believer in the existence of justice, but somebody has to find an explanation. Somebody has to at least know what happened. That's the best thing you can do for the dead. And so I was drawn to the importance of that, I think.
I mean, who doesn't love a good murder mystery? I grew up as a child. I think my parents thought something was wrong with me because all I would watch was Remington Steele and Murder, She Wrote and Cagney and Lacey and like all of these police procedurals and mystery shows and Encyclopedia Brown. That was I was fat as Danny diet of that growing up. I think at the end of the day, murder in particular is just so taboo. We just cannot help to be fascinated by it. I also think that there's almost a recognition in that I think many of us, myself included, have never been touched by a crime so grievous. But there's also the recognition that we could. No one ever thinks that this is going to happen to them or ever thinks that this could happen to someone they know or even that they think they know, and yet it happens every day. There's this very interesting tension between it feels so far away, it can never happen to me, along with the realization of that it happens to ordinary people and the people around them and their loved ones every single day. And I'm just really fascinated by that, this notion of when that happens to someone, or a loved one, it really is just a super traumatic event that forever changes them and forever changes everyone around them. And it's just a very rich territory just to think about and to write about.
Fascinating. And what drew you to the
Well,
business?
so, first I had this, like I'm sure you, a compelling desire to write for many years before I actually wrote, before I had a story to tell. You know, I would try to find stories, but I never had a story. Until I discovered that an agent who had read a couple of my short stories liked them, but he said, we don't publish short stories, there's no market for short stories, but you have a novel. And the only story that I had was the death of an uncle of mine who was murdered in 1953 by the CIA. He was a bioweapons scientist. It's a pretty famous case by the name of, his name is Frank Olson. And I then began to write that story, and I couldn't really write it because it was too close to me. So I wrote 2 other books first, and then my 3rd novel was his story. But what drew me to him was this idea that he was somebody who was in the CIA, who was uncomfortable with the moral ambiguity of the work he was doing in bioweapons. And he couldn't talk to his wife about the work, and he couldn't confess his doubts about the work to his colleagues, because that would have been somewhat traitorous. So he was closed, locked in, frustrated, and became unstable when he was given LSD, which was thought to be a truth drug. And he was tossed out of a window of the Statler Hotel, which itself was going to be destroyed shortly. And that story, it took me into the spy genre. I never had an idea that I would write about spies or murder, and never have written about either of those 2 things. But I found that the spy genre was interesting because it deals with things that I was interested in, having grown up, you know, through Watergate. And we were sort of a group of people who felt that we couldn't trust government in the same way, and that we were being betrayed by things in Washington. And so I found the spy genre as an interesting way to talk about the moral ambiguities of work that's being done on behalf of, in this case, the US government. And so for me, it was more than genre. I found that you could, in the same way that like Carré writes spy novels, but he doesn't really write about spies. He writes about sort of a social class in England. He talks about betrayal. So his books are love stories. They're stories about betrayal, and yet they're sort of all sort of within the guardrails of genre. And so I found myself being very intrigued by the constraints of genre, which I think is true of murder mysteries as well. Crime allows you to speak very broadly about some things that are sort of somewhat concrete and narrow. And the best crime novels, I think, are ones that really aren't crime novels. I mean, they're sort of like The Great Gatsby. Is it a crime novel? Is it a love story? Is it a story about class? It's probably all of those. And I think the best books in any genre really go beyond genre, and I think I'd be interested, for your view on that.
Yeah, I agree, although I also am kind of allergic when people say a book transcends the genre. Because when you start talking about that, then what you're saying is that by definition, the genre is B level and below, and anything on the A level transcends it. And I think that your books are spy novels. I think Le Carré's books are spy novels. I think that my books are private eye novels. I think they're also trying to be as good novels as they can be. But I think that I do, as long as we're defining genres, I do think I write in one. I really wish we wouldn't define them, but they are defined that way. I also would like to say that you all need to go all the way back to the beginning of Paul's explanation of how he got into this when he said that an agent said, if you had a book, we would take it. It's like, all right, I'm gonna get a book. I'm gonna have a book, you know? There's nothing that moves you so fast as an agent saying they're waiting for your book.
All right, the next question is really about craft, I think, and structure. But I would love to hear each of you talk about the importance of story and plot and character and how you think about it and how you prioritize those elements in your own work. Danielle?
Yeah, for me, it's all about character and characters. It's all about who the people are. I don't outline because I can't, because until I meet the people, I mean, I have Bill and Lydia, I've known them for years now, but until I meet everybody else in the book, I don't know what they're gonna do. And so I don't know how the story will unfold. I have some vague idea. I knew this kid had run away. I had some vague idea of why, I wasn't sure. I knew he had a twin sister who didn't like him very much, he didn't like her either. And I knew certain things. And then I just had to let the story unfold. So for me, character is absolutely critical. Setting is the next thing. Setting kind of defines the story sometimes. When I wrote a book set on a construction site, and those people are different from the people that I wrote about when I set a book in the fashion industry. And so that, to me, it's character, setting, and plot comes out of that.
It's interesting because I think of setting as a character.
Yeah, it absolutely, and you know, when I set a book in New York is really one of the main characters in the book, and I never write about a place I haven't been. I mean, including, you know, a part of Queens. Somebody said to me today, you know, I met the people at the German house at NYU. It's a gorgeous place. You should set a book in Berlin and then you could launch it there. Well, you know, there's a whole nother thing going on, which I would have to go to Berlin to do that. Not a bad idea, but it's, so yeah, I think settings is absolutely critical.
So it's interesting because I've written several of my books in cities I've never been to. I've never been to Beirut. I've never been to Moscow, but people have said, "Oh, you must have been there." But so there's a whole different approach to how we get into that imaginary world, how we make it authentic. And I would say, I think I see my cities through the characters. But just at one point, a guy named Steve Berry, you probably have heard of, best-selling author, when he's asked by aspiring writers, you know, what does he think drives a novel? He says, plot trumps everything. And the same is true with Lee Child. He says, well, some people, literary people, they take the view that, you know, my characters aren't, you know, literary enough. And he said, well, just look at their bank accounts versus my bank account. And it's true. I think plot sells books, but I don't think plot is what drives reviewers. And as a writer, who became a writer later in my life, when I was a little more financially stable, you know, I have a desire to write books about characters. And I do that because when I look at the books that I enjoy reading, The Quiet American, The Great Gatsby, Wuthering Heights, they're all character driven. And, you know, it's Faulkner is the one who said, characters, plot is character. And so if you know your characters well enough, plot and story will emerge from who they are. And that becomes a very powerful way of engaging the reader, as opposed to a plot-driven thing, which sells books. But if you're looking as a writer, you want to create memorable characters and memorable stories. I think you have to start with character.
I agree. Danielle, how do you do it?
For me, it's character. It's character over anything. I suspect maybe some of you in the room have maybe read the Thursday Murder Club stories by Richard Osman, and ask, like, do I remember the plot of the first book? Absolutely not. But I know I will follow those characters into whatever adventure they go to, wherever they go, whatever crime, whatever happens, I will follow those Ron and Ibrahim and Elizabeth, and I will follow them all to the ends of the earth. Yeah, I think creating a really like, if there's not something about the character that you, the reader, are drawn to, whether they're the most, whether you like them or adore them, or whether they're the most delicious villain, and and you love to see how diabolical they're going to be. If that interest in that character, if you don't care about them or just are fascinated by them in some way, then I really don't care what the plot is. Now, there's got to be a good plot, right? Particularly in a mystery, there's genre expectations. People expect to have red herrings and clues and certain things. I'm not saying that it doesn't matter. Obviously, it's very important. But for me, it's about creating just an indelible, memorable character. One of my favorite mystery series is what's his name? Jeff Lindsay from the Dexter series. You might have watched the show on Showtime. If you're not familiar with the show or you're not familiar with the books, if you are familiar with the show, I still really love the books because they're very, very funny. But and he's basically a psychopath serial killer, and his father, who is was a detective at the Miami Police Department, recognizes in his son the traits that he may be a serial killer. So he gives him a set of guidelines that's basically, and he becomes, basically, long story short, is Dexter becomes a blood spatter expert with the Miami PD, and his victims are criminals who can't quite be proven to be criminals, and so they escape prosecution, but he knows they are, and so those are his victims. But he's so charming because he knows he's a psychopath and he knows he has to appear normal. So he, works very hard to appear like a normal human being, and there's a charm in it. So even though he does bad things, I'm still almost always rooting for Dexter.
Okay, let's take a detour from writing, because we all had other careers before we came to this. And so let's talk for a minute about what those careers were and when you gave those up, or if you haven't given them up yet, and what was the moment? Because you had that moment with the agent.
Right.
But you were writing short stories before that, so that was not what made you a writer. So what did you used to do, and do you still do it? And when you sat down and wrote your first short story, what were you thinking?
I have no idea what I was thinking, but I know that
What were you
I
thinking?
came to New York as a young man, 22 years old, like most people, wanting to do something interesting and not really interested in, the sorts of things that would pay the rent, but of course you have to pay the rent. So I had an aspiration to write, but I wasn't very good. My novels were terrible. My wife got pregnant. I got a job. But I made a contract with myself that when I was financially able, I would leave the job and go off and try and write. That happened when I was about 56. And my first novel was published when I was 65. So I am the poster child for those later aged wannabe writers who, think that no, if I'm 50, it's, there isn't time. But I think the three of us really do represent people who had an aspiration to write, had other careers, and were able to sort of pursue that dream. And I know I'm very satisfied. My sons, who were both in their 40s, had no interest in what I was doing. I was a corporate executive at Time Warner, a senior guy, and they had zero interest in what I did. But when I became a writer, they said, "Oh, now we know what you do." One of them is an architect, and the other was a performance artist. So, it's we all get to a place in life that is sort of this meandering byway that is unpredictable, and coincidence is sort of an actor that you can't predict.
Well, I still work. I'm not a full-time author. I work in public relations by day, author by morning and weekend and evening. So you're the poster child for writing later in life, and I am a poster child for, if any viewers have a day job and you're just aspiring to it, and you're wondering when can I find the time? Is it possible? How am I going to balance these two things? That is what I'm in the midst of doing right now. And I write in the margins of my life, but I'm pretty consistent. Actually, I write in the mornings, I write on the subway, I write on my phones on the subway in the waiting room, just really, whatever opportunity I can get.
And what made you start? You have this job and.
Yeah, I always wanted to write. If anyone had asked me as a kid, what are you going to be? I'm like, I'm going to be a writer. And at a certain point, I still felt that inside, but I never actually got my butt properly in a chair and actually got to work. And I don't know, something happened, a few years ago, and I realized I'm going to be a writer. I better actually start writing. And I did, and I think you do. And once you publish a book, I'm sure you have both been on the other end of this. People come up to you, how'd you do it? I have an idea. I have an idea in my head. It's all figured out in my head. I know everything that happens from start to finish. And I go, well, great, that doesn't mean anything unless you write it down. And how do you do it? How do you write a whole book? And I'm like, I don't really have the answer to that. There's no secrets, there's no shortcuts. It just sit down and you write it, and you write a really terrible first draft that is cringeworthy and embarrassing. I'm writing an extremely cringeworthy and embarrassing book 2 to glory right now. That will get better, but it's not there yet. I've had some very nice reviews for the book, and everyone says, oh, aren't you must be walking around feeling so great and feeling so satisfied. I'm like, no, because I'm writing another book right now, and it is humbling me. So absolutely not. It is, I don't know if it will ever be easier, but yeah, it's. But I'm so glad that I did it, even though it continues to be hard, because how are you ever going to know? And your wildest dreams just may come true. I mean, my kind of big dream for my debut novel was to be in the New York Times and to be in that mystery column that runs every month. And even more specific than that, I told myself, I want the illustration. There's an illustration that accompanies that. She reviews like 4 or 5 books every month. There's an illustration. And, wrote it, and, told my editor, I'm like, can we please just try? I know it's a big get, but can we just try? And I got it, and I got the illustration, and the illustration is hanging in my home right now. So I never thought that this time last year, I did not have a book deal. Literally this time last year, I did not have a book deal. So if any of you have an inkling that you might want to write, give it a try.
Yeah, and I'm sort of the poster child for in between. I always wanted to write also when I was a kid, that if you had asked me that question, I would have had the same answer. But as I grew up, I thought, well, you can't just be a writer because you want to be a writer. I mean, you have to have, I don't know, a sign from God or something. You can't just write books. So I went to architecture school. I became an architect, and I had a really great job. It was such a good job that when I realized I wasn't happy, I also realized it wasn't the job, it was the career. I couldn't go out and get a better architecture job. This one, it had everything you wanted. It had great projects, it had great people. And as soon as I realized that, this little voice in the back of my head said, well, weren't we gonna write a book? So I started. I put my butt in the chair and I started, and it was immediately the most satisfying thing I had ever done. It was very, very hard, and it remains hard, and I have the same reaction you have sort of right now, because my book came out today, and shouldn't I be, except that I'm working now on one to follow up another one that comes out in April, and I have, this much work to do in this much time, and so no, you don't. The only time you'd ever be totally thrilled when your book comes out is when you're retiring and it's your last book.
Wow,
but
that's dark.
But it's worth it. It is so worth it. It's all I have to say.
So to move on from craft to an aspect of craft. Setting is important. How important is it in your works? And how did you get to Louisiana? And how did you get to New York? And then I'll tell people how I got to Beirut.
The book was always going to be set in Louisiana. My family's from Louisiana. I was not raised there, but I have visited there and spent pretty much every summer of my life, of my childhood in Louisiana. It was originally going to be in New Orleans. And I thought I would go down to New Orleans and do a bunch of research, but my family's from Lafayette and I know Lafayette. And I thought, why don't I just show Lafayette? Because New Orleans is a wonderful, magical, specific place, but it is not Louisiana. It is not the entirety of Louisiana, and I feel that that never really gets depicted from a popular culture standpoint. So I really wanted to show Lafayette specifically. And there are, when I think about setting and how to bring setting alive in a book, I always ask myself this question of, what are the things that can only be found in Lafayette, Louisiana, that cannot be found anywhere else? I'll tell you what cannot be found anywhere else. In Lafayette, there are drive-through daiquiri stands where you go through and there are daiquiris and they have them in styrofoam cups and they put a piece of tape where the straw should go, and that counts as a legal closed container. So that's only found in that part of Louisiana. It's insane. I've seen this my whole life. Still to this day, every time I go down there and I pass all the stands, my mind is blown. I just don't know how it happens. And so, and then there's, there are aspects of food and certain events and festivals that are very unique to that part of Louisiana. So, it's funny because I'm a reader, I should say. I am a reader that does not like a lot of exposition. I do not love writers, with one exception, and that one exception is Pat Conroy. He's probably my favorite writer. But when there tends to be a long explanation of a place, I get bored and I tend to skim. And so as a writer, I try to just give just only what you need to paint a picture and then move on. And in the first draft of my book, I didn't do enough setting. And then, this is the feedback I would get is bring setting to life. And I was really worried about that because I'm a reader who doesn't love lengthy explanations of places and descriptions. But when I added just a touch more, it really made a difference. So unfortunately, setting is important.
I think setting is absolutely critical. I mean, we talked about this a little bit before, but I like what you said about New Orleans is not Louisiana. The center of Midtown is not New York. It's Midtown Manhattan. It's Midtown Brooklyn too, and I guess because I'm from the Bronx, but I'm very interested in what goes on in the outer boroughs, which is really 80% of the landmass and 90% of the population of New York. And if you include New Jersey as a sixth borough, which is not that hard to do, but I find setting absolutely critical. The way a place smells, the way the light falls, the kind of when I picture a room, even if I don't use it all, I have to know when my characters walk into a room, are the chairs upholstered, are they wooden, is there a carpet? Is the place a terrible mess? What does it look like? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? And that's the room, and then it expands to the whole place. And the things that happen that don't happen other places. I have a scene in this book set in Times Square among the costume characters. Well, where else are you going to find that? And those are the things that really interest me. And the interesting thing about plot is that we narrative writers are, no matter what we're trying to do, like show people New York or whatever, we are the only artists who have to have a story, have to have a plot. Painters don't, musicians don't, only narrative writers. No matter what you're trying to do, you need that. But to me, what I'm trying to do is show you these characters and show you this place and have you kind of wish you'd been there at some point. That's what I want to do. I have a book set in Mississippi. It just astounded me what goes on in Mississippi. So I want you all to know what goes on. So that's what that's why I write. And how did you get to Beirut, which you haven't gotten to?
Right, exactly. So as I'm listening to you, I think I have the same approach, but and setting is critical. From my point of view, it's not about descriptive phrasing, about what you see. It's really about mood. And most importantly, it's about what draws a character to a place. Because by being in a particular place, like being in this room, we all have a reason for being here. And it's the reasons that brought us here that becomes interesting. So in my case, Beirut was the place where this young woman had to go in order to be part of this operation. And that allows me to explore a lot of things about her, a lot of things about Beirut. And the fact that I never went to Beirut really isn't that relevant because I do a lot of research and I do a lot of outlining. And so we have a different approach to writing. But what I find is that by reading memoirs of people who grew up in a place, you get those details that I then appropriate and I put them in the novel through the character's eyes. And so in my case, the city isn't Beirut. The city is the Beirut seen through the eyes of the characters. And it's not a topographical Beirut. It's really the psychological and cultural Beirut seen through the characters. And just as your anecdotes about those things that are really unique to a place, that's what makes a setting come alive. Because they're things that feel real and authentic about a place. And I think that's the most important thing. So when people come up to me and says, you know, you were never in Moscow and you were never in Beirut, because the novels that you wrote that are set in those cities seem so real. And to some extent, that's sort of the magician's trick that we as writers pull. We create this thing, put some words together, and the result of that for the reader's mind is that they're in that world. They sort of experience the world that we've invented, which is a pretty remarkable thing. And the way you do it is through all these sort of craft tricks, you know, creating characters and setting, putting together the story so that it becomes an immersive experience for the 12 or 14 hours that a reader spends with the story.
Well, I think you should go to Beirut, you know, you can expense it, so.
Well, it was being written during the pandemic, so even if I wanted to, I could go
Research
now.
We all write from different points of view that are different than my own. SJ, you write as a man, you're through a male perspective. Paul, you've written through female characters. I write through a character that is a woman, but much older and in very different circumstances than I am in. SJ, can you talk about that and how you get there and why you made that decision?
Yeah, I write, well, I have different voices now because I have also a new series, but I write in the series as Bill and Lydia alternating. But Bill was my first character, and I created him because the stories you can tell from that iconic white male private eye are stories that can't be told by another kind of character, because that's a character who, and if you go back through the private eye literature from the beginning of the subgenre, they are all pretty much this same guy who could have had the world on a string if he wanted to. They are all educated up to a point. Sometimes they drop out of college because they can't stand it. They are all healthy. They're all straight. They all have gone into business or gone into the military or whatever, and then left or gotten kicked out because they can't deal with the compromises you have to make to become the guy who has the world on a string. So they step voluntarily outside of that possibility, and because of that, they can tell the stories as this voluntary outsider, they can tell the stories of the corruption of the world that they left. And this is, Philip Marlowe does this, and they all, Sam Spade, this is what they all do. And so that was the voice that I wanted to write from, because I was interested in that, seeing what the world you were entitled to really looks like, taking the veil off and seeing how ugly it is. And the reason I also write as a Chinese American woman is because I gave Bill Lydia as a sidekick, and a couple of chapters in the first book, she made it very clear that she would be a sidekick in this book, but not forever. So I figured, all right, let me try her and give her a book, and so then he became a sidekick. And that's a whole other, you can tell a whole other series of stories by working with a character who would not have inherited the world, no matter what. Her fight is different because she needs to constantly fight to be who she wants to be, although her family and society and nobody wants her to be that. So so these were deliberate choices, really.
This is the second protagonist is a woman. And when I wrote the first one, I had to ask myself the question, could I pull it off? And I began to think about novels that were written by authors who were the opposite sex or gender of the protagonist. And I thought of Wuthering Heights. And I think about Heathcliff, who was this remarkable male character written by a 29-year-old young woman in the north of England. And I think about Anna Karenina, written by a later-aged Russian man. And these were, I said, well, not that I think I can be as good as they are, but I began to think about how did they do it. And what I discovered is that, you don't write men or women, you write people, you write characters, and you give them ambitions and joy and sadness. You give them human characteristics, and that is what makes them interesting. And so that's how I sort of began to think about, writing, in a gender that was not my birth gender. And then in the case of Beirut, I knew I had to have a female protagonist to sort of make her sympathetic in this very dark world. So she's alone, she, has her own, emotional sort of difficulties being a single woman in a war zone, and so to make her vulnerable, I had to give her something that I didn't want to give to a male spy. But it all came down to who were, what her emotions were, and we all have the same, emotions as humans.
For me, personally, I am very interested in the inner lives of women, and in particular, women of a certain age, older women. I'm just very interested. This is another obsession I have along with crime that I've always had. As a child, I was watching Murder, She Wrote, and that was not a coincidence that it was both crime and it was an older woman. I'm very interested in how a woman ages with a measure of grace and dignity and spunk, I guess, for lack of a better term. I was very interested in exploring an older Black woman in particular, because my mom is an older Black woman, and I see how people look at her. I see how people, I see how people treat her, and often it's not well, in terms of closing doors on her faces or just overlooking her in a line. And my mom is really smart, my mom's really funny, she's really, really shrewd. And I think that there's, I think this happens not just to older Black women, but just older women in general. And I thought, well, isn't that also just a great disguise as well for an amateur detective or a sleuth, older woman, an older Black woman who's like minimized and overlooked and kind of invisible. There are many scenes in my book where she is overlooked. People look at her, they think she's a help. And a friend of mine was like, don't you think that, she goes to a country club and they show her to the back of the kitchen because they think she's the help. And a friend of mine said, that's a little far-fetched. And I said, oh, really? You think so? My very young, someone my age, who's a vice president at a very well-known financial institution in the city, had to go to, and works in PR, had to go to a client event at a country club, and her Uber drove her to the back of the kitchen because they assumed that she was the help. And so one, I'm very interested in this demographic in general, and two, I thought that it was a phenomenal kind of disguise or ruse for a detective, because no one thinks that she's smart, no one thinks that she's cunning, no one thinks that her mind is, operating 10 paces ahead. And I thought that was a really fun thing to play from a detective standpoint of view.
Yeah, being underestimated.
Being underestimated, yeah, I think,
Really terrific tool, yeah.
yes,
If you could take it and not, throw it away, and Gloria does.
Yeah.
Gloria's like, oh, you're underestimating.
All the best vibes, like smiling.
Yeah.
Follow the
Yeah.
vocabulary.
yeah, that's true.
Absolutely, yeah. Maybe we should ask, if people have questions, or is it time for that?
That's great, I would ask you to start.
Yeah, are there questions in the room?
This is a very common question that we're gonna get, but do you know the ending when you start? How do you work? Do you plot it all out, or it sounds like you feel your way along? I've been waiting for my characters to talk to me. I've had a long wait.
All right, I'm gonna repeat the question for the streaming audience. Do we know the end? Do we outline? How do we get from the beginning to the end? And this is a writer who's been waiting for her characters to talk to her, and she's still waiting. So, Paul, because I know you outlined, did you say so?
Yeah, so I'm probably a little different because I start with character and I create a dossier for each of my characters, which may be 5 or 6 pages long. Then I outline the book and I end up with an outline of every chapter. So my outline may be 60 single spaced pages. And I know the ending before I start writing. But in some ways, that's the nature of a novel that's based on research. So I'm not looking inside myself, but the looking at myself happens when I actually start writing. Because I know the world that I'm interested in. I know the characters, and that gives me the freedom to be able to explore those parts of the characters that I didn't figure out in advance, which makes the research outlining process probably 6 or 7 months long. And then the writing, the first draft may take 6 weeks. And then I do 4 or 5 drafts in the next 5 weeks, in the next 6 months, which is a little different, than other people, but you just have to figure out what works for you. And
You know who does it that way is Jeffrey Deaver, who will do a 200-page outline for a 300-page book. And the outline takes him more time than the book. But essentially, I've always thought, in his case, he's writing the book. He's just telling himself he's not, so that all the scary things that happen when you get stuck and stuff, you're not writing the book, so you're not getting stuck in your book.
Yeah. I think I'm probably a hybrid between these two fine writers here. I like to say, I know ABC and XYZ, but not elemental B. Like, I have no idea how to get there. And so what I'll do is I will usually start a book with great enthusiasm, so I'll just get started and dive in, and then somewhere around chapter 5 or 6, I'm like, okay, wait a minute, what happens? What happens? So then the outline, I do a whole Excel PowerPoint thing. It's very tedious, and I will outline maybe 5 or 6 chapters at a time. So I'll outline, okay, this is what's going to happen for this next chunk of the book, and then I'll go away and I'll write that, and then I'll outline the next portion. So it's almost like I fill up the gas tank, I drive 400 miles, pull over to the rest stop, and then kind of organize myself, and then get back on the highway. It's more of my approach.
Margaret Rowell said many years ago that she worked, someone asked a similar question, and she said works back from the ending.
Yeah,
And I
there,
thought that saves a lot of time, because when I've written forward without knowing, you spend a lot of time going in the wrong direction.
well, it depends whether they're wrong directions, I mean, if I couldn't define an ending for any of my books, because as I said, I don't know what the characters are doing. I don't even know who they are, somebody has to come in, and I have two characters who are now recurring, who came in one of my books because I needed something very specific from them. And Bill Smith did, and he called them, and they came, and they met him at a diner, and then they wouldn't leave, and they haven't left yet. So I can't, but who works backwards like that is, okay, this happens all the time. Son of the Circus, The World According to Garp.
John
Irving.
John Irving. John Irving doesn't start a book until he hears the last sentence in his head. And he writes that down, and then he writes the paragraph that led up to that, and the chapter that led up to that paragraph, and so on and so on.
I see the end sort of as a North Star, which is a navigation point, and you may get there in a variety of sort of unpredictable ways. You're thrown off course by some storm in chapter 5, but it ends up being a navigation point for the story. But that's, as you said, people do it differently. I think you sort of have to figure out what you're comfortable with. And again, I think we all said, for us, character is important. So where does the character want to go? What's the challenge? What's the tragedy? What's the choice that leads to that character's end journey? And for me, that's how I ask the question. What is it that I want this character to suffer or experience, and how does he or she then get out of that in a way that leaves the reader in a satisfied, moment?
Other questions in the room?
Yeah, well, I think too, first of all, isn't it true that a very small percentage of murders are solved?
Okay, the first question is it true, in real life, is it true that a very small percentage of murders are solved?
That's true. Most murders are not solved.
And then the other thing I wanted to say, which came to my mind when you said you never knew anybody, and having lived sort of, interesting life, but ordinary and not crime-ridden, I knew 2 murders. There was a kid that killed another kid when my brother was in prep school. And the guy was still in jail for many years, something from a chemistry set. And another one was an uncle who went to pick up his daughter in a divorce situation, a very famous hotel. And his wife lifted the window and jumped to her death. And that was the front page of the paper.
Oh dear.
Yeah, so I'm saying, from an ordinary kind of family, but I the minute you said that, I thought, my God, I know of 2 murders in my, life.
Well, that's the thing as well. I've been extremely lucky, and I've not been close to a murder. But then there are some people who have experienced a lot of loss through very violent means. Who have multiple family members who are murdered, or who have been in accidents or drug overdose, and certain people live that misfortune. So you're right. I mean, it can be. It's totally common.
Well, and that's
Terrifying.
what you said, which is kind of great, is that it's here we are, and up till today, you haven't experienced a violent, but up until Gloria's best friend was killed, she hadn't either. And then she woke up one morning and she had. And that can happen to all of us. It's less likely to happen to a spy because they will have already, if you're operating in Beirut, you will have seen this and either lived through it or decided to head home. But it could happen at any minute.
It could happen, and I forget where I read this. I read a lot of things, and then I forget where I read them, and then I can't attribute them properly. But just know that I'm not taking credit for saying this. But there was an article that I read somewhat recently about why women in particular are drawn to crime, and true crime in particular. And someone had made the comment, or another crime writer who said, the women are drawn to true crime the way that men are drawn to war fiction. There's this sense of, I think some men, particularly men of a certain generation, of like, if I get called into war, what will I do? How will I respond? How will I respond in this situation? And unfortunately for women, there is the very real reality of far too many women being the victim of crime at the hands of someone that they know or love, and watching something like the ID channel and seeing, a husband who, a stranger sleeping in your bed kind of story. I do think there is a little bit of, what would I do? How would I get out? What would I do? Where would I go?
I had a friend who used to say she read serial killer books, so that the more she knew, the less likely it was to happen to her. Okay, fine,
I have two questions. One is, what's been the most impactful thing you've heard from a reader, either professional reader or just, reader, that impacted your future writing?
Right, let's start with that one. The thing that most impacted your future writing that you heard from a reader.
Well, my book's been out for 2 months, so I can't say that I've gotten, I did get an email from a woman who said she loved my book until she got to the pornography and of my book, and she wanted my assurance that book 2 was clean. So that was,
So you get all kinds of.
Did you give it to her?
no.
In case, this makes you worried, there is no pornography.
No, there's no pornography. I'm not a pornographer.
There's sex,
I assure you.
but, there's a difference.
It's an interesting, it is a very timely question for me because I am writing the follow-up. And I have spent not a ton of time, but a decent amount of time reading reviews and Goodreads in particular, which are straight from readers. And they say as a writer, you should not read those, that they are for readers, not for writers. But I think it's fun. I really enjoy reading it all, the good and the bad. And I've gotten some, I think, some valid feedback. And a dear friend who is kind of my best editor, my beta reader, and gives me probably the best advice, has told me to stay out of the bad neighborhood that is the internet and Goodreads and not pay it any mind. But I don't know, I think some of them have had some good feedback about just the structure that I'm considering moving forward. So it wasn't to me specifically, it was just on the platform, but I thought a couple of them had some good suggestions.
For me, the most kind of exciting and affirming thing was I have been writing Lydia Chin, that voice, for a long time, and I do in the back of my mind always worry that I'm not getting it right because she's a Chinese American woman and I'm not. And at one point I was at a book signing and a young Chinese American man came up to get his book signed, and he said, "I really just have one question. When did you meet my mother?" I thought, okay, I'm good.
So I guess I have two answers to that. One is somebody who started writing in my late 50s, when I got feedback on the first couple of novels where people really enjoyed it, I felt great. I felt validated because it's, the writing process itself is sort of lonely. You don't know whether you're going to be able to do something that somebody else is going to like. So that was important. And the second thing is that I've learned to listen, not so much of the people who, on Goodreads, because by that time the book's over, but for all the people who read a book in process and make criticisms, they could be my editor, my wife, my sons, whoever it is, or my writers group. I really listen because when you're in the novel in process, you've sort of forgotten about the rest of the world, and you're not looking at it the way that somebody will look at it when they're reading it for the first time. So I don't see the problems. I don't see the gaps. I don't see the ways in which some aspect of character doesn't work. So listening to them as opposed to saying, of course it's right. I wrote it, it's right. But listening becomes a very important part of the process of getting to a final manuscript.
Yeah, I think it's when someone tells you, I think you should make this part longer or something, you may not want to listen to that advice, but the issue is they had a problem with what you wrote. They thought it all went by too fast, they got confused. That's what they're really telling you. And if you listen and you hear that, then you can fix it in a way that may not be what they told you to do, but it does need fixing.
There's an interesting story. There was Len Guyton and John Le Carre were both edited by the same New York editor.
How do you know that?
And when Len Guyton would get feedback from this guy, Gottlieb, who was the editor, a very famous editor, the editor would say, on such and such page, you have somebody saying something and you're too circumspect. And so he would get the manuscript back and he would have changed one word, Whereas Le Carre, when he was given, feedback about how a scene didn't work, he would return an entirely rewritten scene. So both novelists, are very successful, but they had a very different approach to feedback from their editors. One guy said, yeah, that's it. And the other one said, it's gonna be totally different.
And Le Carre is a better writer.
And he's,
In word for word, sentence for sentence.
yeah, I would say so. Definitely.
You had another question?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask you how humor factors into your writing in terms of the particular character or whatever. I particularly like Kate Atkinson, and who writes, I think, really good mysteries.
Yeah, I love her.
And she uses humor so effectively.
Let me go first here. If you're writing a novel like I'm writing, where there's tension and there's darkness, you have to break that up. And the best way to do it was with humor. So having funny characters in the midst of a difficult scene actually makes the scene work. It allows the reader to sort of come and pull back from that tension. And one way of saying it is, when you're writing a hot scene, you need to use cool language. And so you're always sort of going back and forth between, what's happening on the page and what the reader is experiencing and how they experience it. And humor is a way to punctuate, the tension in a really important way.
Yeah, I agree. I can't help but use it every now and then. I also have written some pretty dark stuff, but my two main characters are kind of wise asses anyway. So it's in the dialogue, and I think it's we all do it. We all use that in our lives. The book I was thinking of that did that so beautifully is The Sympathizer, where he will take you to where you almost can't stand it. And then, but because his narrator is an ironic, funny guy, he'll pull back a little, he'll say something funny, and then you can go on, the reader can go on. So, and then I do things like, every now and then in a book, I just crack myself up because I have to, and I'll write a scene that I think is hilarious, and I'll leave it in, and then things go from there. But I think that humor is you really need it in the kind of books we write. And you clearly are a fan of humor.
Which is funny because that was all accidental. I did not set
Really?
out to write a humorous novel, no. For me, humor comes from the character. I can't write a joke to save my life. Like, I can't write anything funny. I think the humor in my book comes from the fact that my character is so petty and kind of judgmental and has a very particular worldview, that the aperture is pretty narrow. And so I just put her in situations and watch her bristle. then that's where the humor comes from. It's not from me trying to be funny or like writing anything humorous. It's just putting my character in situations where I know she will be deeply uncomfortable, or situations that can challenge her worldview, and then I just kind of let her go.
You may not want to answer this. Have you gotten blowback about your portrayal of the Mossad in this book?
All right, let me, for this streaming audience, has Paul gotten blowback, from about his portrayal of Mossad and, the Middle East in general?
No, actually, I mean, the
They're
only.
busy right now.
I'm sorry?
They're busy right now.
They're
Right,
busy, right?
No, I haven't. Well, of course, if somebody was offended, they probably wouldn't.
Well, if you get shot, we're gonna know.
Or thrown out of a window.
It's, it's just a sad, tragic situation, so. So no, that's the answer to the question.
Are we making book recommendations?
Oh, yeah, are there other questions in the room, we're out of time, is that what's
We're
happening?
not out of time. I'm just saying, we wanted to, if I heard correctly, we're gonna maybe.
Yeah, we had a last question where we were gonna recommend books.
That's great.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions from the room? I might just throw in one more that might be sort of on the brief side.
Yeah.
Often when we've had mystery writers, people talking about mystery genre in this space, and people say, why do you love mysteries so much? Why do you write mysteries? And the word puzzle comes up, or the word, like you get in one end and you really want to know how it turns out. And I'm interested that was not an answer that I heard among you. Have I got the wrong end of the stick, or is that just not a relevant concept? Is it a default answer that maybe isn't really accurate, but it's just easy to say?
No, I mean, that's an important part of a mystery, and for me, it is the most tedious and boring part of writing the book, even though it is a mystery, because for me, I am much more interested in the journey that my characters go on, where they start and where they end up, and the murder is really a vehicle to, like, murders, really, you're stress testing a whole, a family, a community, and a murder mystery allows you to kind of bring that to life. But the puzzle and who did what, and the red herring and the clues, it's essential. I find that to be very difficult to write. But it has to be there. I would say that as a reader, I enjoy it. As a writer, I don't enjoy it.
Yeah, I think that the puzzle aspect, to me, the whole point of the genre, the whole point of the mystery crime genre is explanation. In real life, you don't get explanation. You walk out of here, you get hit by a bus, it's because you crossed the street and the bus came. There's no reason. In a crime novel, there would be a reason. There would be somebody had pushed you, or that bus driver was sitting there for 45 minutes waiting for you to come out because he knew you, or something. There's a reason. And this is why we read crime, is to find it, to be presented with a problem and to find that it has an answer. And within that context, you can do all kinds of things. You can show us Lafayette, Louisiana, in New York, the characters, someone like Glory, who has no idea how narrow she is, and yet can see the world widely enough to understand who's doing what and with which and to whom in a way that other people can't. But it's within the context of people want to know, not even what the answer is. They want to know there is one, because in life, there isn't.
So many spy novels are not mysteries, but some are. And the analogy is that the murder to a murder mystery, the body to a murder mystery is like the mole in a spy novel, where the question is, who's the mole? And one of the things that I am able to do by doing a lot of outlining is I'm able to capture what I'll call surprises and the unexpected, which are all part of information you withhold until the appropriate moment where there's the aha moment you're surprising, not you're surprising, but the audience, the reader is surprised by a turn of events that isn't, immediately apparent. And so I do think, and it's not like I spent a lot of time with the puzzle, but I do know that you've got to be able to set up the story and the characters and the plot points in a way that is always taking the reader from chapter to chapter, always giving them a sense that they're almost there to understand what's going to happen. And within that, you need humor and you do all the other things. But I think the puzzle is again, I don't spend a lot of time with it, but there have to be puzzle pieces to make the final product work.
Thank you.
Okay, and we will end on book recommendations, books that you would, in your genre, recommend without hesitation. Yeah.
A big inspiration for me becoming a writer and writing the kind of book that I did was an author named Alan Bradley, and he's written a series called the Flavia de Luce series. And it is set in England after the war in a village with a vicar and like all of those things that you see in a traditional cozy mystery. But the protagonist, Flavia de Luce, is 11 years old, and she's a chemistry mastermind, and she's kind of sadistic. And I have a theory that there's only two groups of people who can say anything without getting into too much trouble, and that's children and women of a certain age. So I'm the woman of a certain age book, and Flavia is the child. So that's one. Another book, this isn't straight up in my genre. It I would say, kind of crosses between the spy thriller and mystery, but is a book called American Spy by Lauren Wilkinson. And it's set in the 80s of a Black woman who's working in the FBI. So she's like hit a ceiling, and the CIA asked to borrow her for a mission to overthrow the government in Burkina Faso, which was a real thing that the CIA did. And then there's a whole mystery and a love story and everything, and I just thought it was a total page turner. I loved it. So American Spy by Lauren Wilkinson.
So I love great writing. So Graham Greene is, a favorite of mine, and The Quiet American is a book I go back to because it's political, it's personal, it's Catholic, it's just a wonderful book. And then I'm going to do three. Joe Cannon, who is a contemporary writer of spy fiction, is just a great writer and a good friend. And then The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which is, if you haven't read it, I really recommend it. It's a brilliant book that really, launched his career. And it's set right at that cusp of, Kennedy had been assassinated 2 months before. The Berlin Wall had gone up 2 years before. It was that very dark, moody, depressing period in time, and he captures that in the book. And that book sort of took the spy fiction out of the misogyny and fantasy of James Bond and made it sort of realistic. And it's a very powerful book.
I would recommend, without hesitation, a book called Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood. Yeah, she's a great writer anyway, but this book has everything. I love that book. And then a book which you probably can't even find anymore. It never really caught fire, this series, but a book by a guy named Peter Spiegelman. The book is called Black Cat. It came out a number of years ago. It is kind of a perfect detective novel. So if you can find that, and I'm going to do three also because I also just read one that was hilarious. It's called Counterfeit by Kristen Chen, and it's about the world of very, very, very high-end handbags. Yeah, really. So it's worth reading.
All right, I'm gonna do a third.
I think you should.
I just finished reading The Housekeepers by Alice Hay. And it is a very Bridgerton murder mystery, kind of upstairs versus downstairs. I loved it.
All right,
It's a new one.
so I think that's it, Thank
I
you
know
very
there's a
much.
Perth Museum in Amsterdam